This research informed my current book project for OUP's Classical Presences series on Greco-Roman antiquity in British children's culture, and an essay in Pasts at Play, Childhood Encounters with History in British Culture, published last year by Manchester University Press, which I edited with Barbara Gribbling. I'm planning a future more extensive survey of how classics was exploited as cultural currency in periodicals, and would love to hear from anyone interested in related research. Even as the privileged status of classics in education began to be questioned towards the end of the 19th century, versions of Greco-Roman antiquity created for and by children proliferated. Some of children's most sustained encounters with the past were enabled by the Victorian press. As the developing print media was exploited for an ostensibly younger market, a wider range of publications appeared, aimed at providing edifying and entertaining reading matter. The burgeoning variety and relative affordability of periodicals enabled large readerships, encouraged interactivity through competitions, and fostered a sense of community, particularly through letters pages. While young characters reenacted ancient scenes, such as in this article on toys, in Kind Words for Boys and Girls, or attended fictional schools, as in this story from St. Nicholas in 1879, informative articles explained historical characters and archaeological discoveries, details which could be mined for answers to puzzles or recounted in prize essays. Such evidence demonstrates the challenges of reaching historical children's voices through their submissions when these were mediated by adult editors, or retold as adult reminiscences of school days, which often highlighted traumatic experiences at public schools and sometimes represented this as comic. It also emphasises specific ideologies, particularly patriotism, religious or moral behaviour, and gendered role models, promoted to child readers and by child contributors, camouflaged by the classical content. When such interactive journalism is placed alongside children's encounters with antiquity and other media, the reception of Greco-Roman antiquity in children's culture becomes a powerful measure of societal values. Today I'm going to focus on puzzles, such as this double acrostic, which often relied on extensive and detailed classical knowledge. My selection highlights the nexus they embody between accessibility, interaction and relevance, all issues negotiated in these publications, which aims to balance pedagogy and play. This is the story of elite knowledge working in different ways throughout society. As has been shown in relation to Shakespeare, fairy tales and scientific knowledge, periodicals were accessible to new, wider audiences. Classics occupies a particularly delicate position. Linguistic skill in Latin and Greek was an elite marker, yet mythological stories had long been common to chapbooks and street entertainments, as well as inclusive venues such as Astley's Amphitheatre. At the same time, fierce debate raged in the 1860s, the same time as the earliest of my examples, over the relevance of classical education, while the rise of the modern side prompted anxiety in my later examples, even as exhibitions of unearthed antiquities in London prompted wild excitement. Puzzles get to the heart of these issues. In enabling reader participation, they embody active consumption, and especially the circulation and acquisition of classical knowledge. As Siminovich explains in Puzzling the Reader, puzzle pages were the most popular and widely read section of periodicals. I'm going to focus around a rather self-conscious set of articles from Boys' Own in the 1880s and 1890s, contrasted with a representative selection of puzzles from other titles in the 60s and 70s. Together these represent the mid to upper end of the children's periodicals market in the last third of the 19th century. In analysing these versions of classical antiquity, marketed at both children and of course the adults whose money was usually purchased the periodicals, I'm going to focus on the following questions. Firstly, how did periodicals enact mass consumption of classics? Who played them? My examples range from a penny weekly to 6 pennies monthly. They seem more ephemeral than expensive board games or toy theatre sets, but could be bound for posterity, and subscriptions could cement longer relationships. As we'll see, girls, boys and adults all participated. Boys' Own especially appealed to old boys. Secondly, how do they show classical knowledge working commercially? Successful periodicals had to ensure repeat custom, and in the case of children's periodicals, when parents were often the buyers and palatable instruction was their selling point, there's an especially dynamic process of educating readers and reflecting or playing with expected prior knowledge. So we'll consider what you needed to know or to research, to play and solve the puzzles. And finally, what sort of use or significance of the classical past do these puzzles reveal? And how especially did playing with them familiarise or other the past? Unsurprisingly, many puzzles revolved around educational staples such as the Trojan War myths or iconic moments of Greek and Roman history. However, there are many obscure names in the puzzles, often mined from contemporary reference books, which are really rather tricky. They also, as we'll see, often share comic anachronistic updating. So, consuming classics. It's telling that the Boys' Own series, Fun from the Classics, was inspired in 1882 by a story in an earlier issue about Latin classes. After some examples of comic mistranslations drawn from elite institutions such as Westminster School, just as telling is the author's suggestion that readers could have the chance of a laugh at their sisters with one of the dog Latin verses, if she fails to make the third line scan. These verse riddles, which he explains are known technically as macaronics, are basically bilingual puns, and I've translated the Latin bits into square brackets below. Here Oddfellow is expecting that most girls without Latin schooling would mistake miles, soldier, for the English miles, as in kilometres. This joke, while suggesting that some girls did come into contact with Boys' Own, marks the publication out firmly as a male space. Similarly, towards the end of the article, Oddfellow's admission that he sometimes receives a postcard inscribed in Greek characters, which effectively protects it from the eyes of the servants, at first sight suggests middle and upper class readers, even though the weekly penny price tag made it, as Ellis points out, more accessible financially to working class children. Perhaps this is an example of its mission to, as Gillian Avery describes, bring the ethos of the public schools to the elementary schools. Readership and requisite knowledge continued to concern Oddfellow. 3 months later he reported that "my previous paper seems to have interested a good many boys, old and young." He proceeded to publish submitted examples of grammatical puzzles, dog Latin riddles, and palindromes, some without translations. Strikingly, right at the end, he recalls that "many boys nowadays do not learn Latin, so for their consolation I append a couple of French puzzles." And he also includes instructions on how to use them, very helpfully. They should be read very quickly. He addressed this issue of language acquisition explicitly 4 months later, in March 1883, having received and published still more comments and contributions. As you can see, his surprise that boys seem to take more interest in Greek and Latin than I thought possible is emphasised by the decorated capital letter, ironically showing a rather unclassical boy in medieval-style armour. What proves that classics at school is not defunct yet is his conviction that no one can find any pleasure in deciphering a macaronic, that's the bilingual puns, or construing a puzzle, who hasn't made some acquaintance with ancient authors. And his postbag proves that his readers still do have the requisite linguistic skills. Cementing the ongoing relationship with schooling, he proceeds to print more submissions, including some incorrect exam translations. Despite a further submission, it's interesting that Boys' Own then took a break. About 6 years later, in October 1888, an article by Philip Kent B.A. entitled "Some Queer Translations" took up the mantle. He also emphasised comic mistaken translations as a universal schoolboy experience, but was rather more inclusive. He carefully explained their principal source as the identity or close similarity between a foreign word and an English one, worked out his examples, and included French examples, but without singling out readers who might only understand those. The same issue of potentially lacking knowledge was previously circumvented by some double acrostics in Beaton's Boyne's Own, which used Tennyson's poetry to elicit the answer Iliad, which in turn formed Guinevere and Lancelot, and also Pope's translation of the Iliad to elicit answers whose initial and final letters gave 2 results, Achilles and Menelaus, characters from the Iliad. Here, knowledge of English literature and translations worked hand in hand with the classical. Of course, the measure of accessibility is in the inherent interactiveness of these puzzles, which brings us to the next question. How do they show classical knowledge working commercially? The Boys' Own Classical Fun series reveals the sheer number of unsolicited submissions that articles could inspire. such as this macaronic dinner invitation sent by an old boy from New York's medical club. And I've translated it for you. Like the joke to confuse sisters, this relied on homophones. The joke is just in using Latin rather than any Latin meaning. And this is sent by an old boy, somebody who's still receiving the magazine as an adult, presumably having enjoyed it as a child, we assume. Many periodicals offered prizes to encourage readers to compete in their puzzle pages. Some were offered by other readers, as in this page from Routledge's Boys magazine, and you can see the publication of the various rules emphasises the popularity of competitions and the degree of interaction they provoked. Note that number 12 here advertises the success of reader participation. They've got too many submitted puzzles. However, despite calling readers our friends, this periodical otherwise kept a strictly commercial focus. They won't pay postage in number 7, or a fee for submissions, and number 14 explains they printed a letter or sign every month, so only those who buy the magazine may compete. Such competitions, and lists of prize winners reveal a much wider range of participants than those assumed by Boys Own. Other publications often include girls' names. In 1876, a prize puzzle report in the American monthly St. Nicholas singled out a little girl who asked her father's friend, the Greek for broad, which then gave her the result Plato. The periodical doesn't explain, but that means broad, and supposedly was a nickname given to the philosopher by his wrestling coach. In acknowledging that the pilot puzzle has required a good deal of patient ingenuity and considerable research in public libraries and among parents and friends, that report emphasised that young competitors who came from England and Scotland, as well as the US and Canada, weren't expected to simply possess the knowledge needed to identify the historical greats, whose biographies they were asked to provide. The puzzle was educational, encouraging the acquisition of extra knowledge. Such feedback could be harsh. While it's not possible to tell class or education, although lists of names and locations, as in St. Nicholas, could be matched to records such as a census, comments on submitted puzzles in Boys of England are described as not up to the mark or confused, which suggests a range of abilities and effort. This feature, Crackers for the Ingenious, asked for only original contributions. This was a cheaper publication at a penny a week and had its greatest following among lower middle class and working class adolescents, although, as Drottner explains, the fact that most conscientious parents banned it increased its appeal for middle class boys. In line with its profile, it seems to have had a much lower classical content, but this page has an interesting example. I'll give you the first one. The official answer is sure. The mountain, Ida, is one of the most recurrent clues across these puzzles and would have been familiar from popular versions of the Iliad. With Table and Talbot, a now extinct hand, the statesman comes out as Pitt and the engineer as Watt. This isn't the greatest submission, but it does illustrate the reciprocity between ancient and modern which underpinned these puzzles and takes us into the third and final question. What do they reveal about the uses and significance of the classical past, and how did playing with the puzzles familiarise or other the past? Similar examples are a double acrostic in Merry and Wise, which comes out as Garibaldi and Alexander. A really interesting comparison in light of their respective political impacts. Garibaldi is nationalist unifier of Italy, and Alexander is the unifier of Greece and creator of a vast empire. I'm not sure how many would have got this before the official answers though, because one clue, the Trojan hero who's only named once in Aeneid 12, as Aeneas' surgeon Japix, is really nasty, even if he is in Smith's classical dictionary. Similarly intriguing parallels are raised by the historical mental pictures puzzles, also in Merry and Wise, which gave brief vignettes to identify characters. One strikingly juxtaposed Spartacus's slave revolts, Henry III's coronation, and the Duke of Suffolk's beheading in Henry VI's reign, all I think linked by political revolt. And that was a similar, the other way round, you could get pictures where you had to write an essay describing what was in the picture. The same Beaton's own issue that used Tennyson's and Pope's poetry in acrostics further juxtaposed the historical Anne Neville, Edward's widow Richard's wife, next to Diana, goddess of the Ephesians, classical but also biblical from Acts of the Apostles. So the classics were important, but one facet of such puzzles, and inextricably embedded in wider national or Christian narratives. And that's something we see in this puzzle here. Frequent recourse to the same suspects, the Iliad, the Aeneid, the Olympic gods, conquerors such as Alexander or Julius Caesar, and they emphasise the familiarity of the ancient world, at the same time as the sheer difficulty of other clues could highlight its otherness. Remember, in a pre-Google world, you needed to read through the reference books to know the more obscure names. But in this particular example, they're all they would have been fairly well-known ones, including from popular culture. Anachronisms emphasise the familiarity of the past, even as the comedy lies in awareness of its otherness, and so the anachronism's incongruity. And that's familiar from classical burlesque as well, where popular shows like The Talking Fish could supplant the goddess Venus in the Aeneid, and that's a newspaper picture of that particular character, the talking fish. Or Shakespearean roles recently performed by Edmund Kean were reprised by Homeric characters. Anachronisms are also perhaps easier to convey than linguistic puzzles, and it's certainly noticeable that the last articles I found in Boy's Own, which resurrect the title Classical Fun, are two sets of visual jokes. 3 statues updated in 1893 to reflect an interesting trio of modern sports, politics, cricket and curling. This one does include some Greek on the discus thrower's plinth, and the next set of mythological cartoons from 1895, that's the original discus thrower, even includes English captions signalling the characters and episodes. So you've got Diana bathing in a bathroom, not a forest, Actaeon clutching a shotgun, and then Orpheus has a violin, and possibly on a golf course there. Eurydice falling down to the underworld, and Hercules is getting the Stymphalian birds with a cannon instead of arrows. And I'd be happy to talk more about those, and also these statues here when it's the actual conference. But it's hard to escape the conclusion that despite the positive response to Oddfellow's linguistic articles a decade earlier, the publishers were increasingly conscious of their readers' changing exposure to classical antiquity. Oddfellow had himself addressed this market-led mentality in his article on ancient jokes, when he exhorted his readers to be thankful that we're better off, that there are now countless writers who make the edification and amusement of boys their chief employment. This comment aptly encapsulates the ultimate commercial purpose of these classical puzzles, within publications subtitled as, for Beaton's Boy's Own, an illustrated journal of fact, fiction, history and adventure, or, in the case of Boys of England, a magazine of sport, sensation, fun and instruction. So, in conclusion, these puzzles and riddles reveal mass consumption among socially wide, actively participating readerships, especially when this evidence is set alongside, for example, prize essays, and a wider range of titles and prices than possible to include here. These classical articles show the importance of these new cross-class audiences enabled by ephemeral media in understanding how knowledge which embodied the elite worked throughout society. Commercialisation of that knowledge is inherent in prize puzzles, but also concern over readers' understanding of content, and the puzzles themselves that open up interpretation only to close it down with a correct answer exemplify complex relationships between assuming and disseminating knowledge, which is linked to wider cultural debates regarding who should have access. So not only do they enable us to track what aspects of classics were expected to be known, but the juxtapositions show that classics as cultural glue was deeply entangled with and even underpinned other forms of knowledge. This sort of playfulness engaged with different pasts, but often privileged antiquity, which as a quintessential school subject highlights how children's commercial encounters with classics balanced education and leisure. So at the moment, in my book project, I'm thinking of classics in children's culture in the long 19th century as an ideal test case for epistemological questions of what counts as knowledge, um, the overlap between child and adult consumers, also autodidacts, and does it matter how the knowledge is gained, if the process is deliberate or accidental, if it's serious or subversive, and tracking through media such as board games, magic lanterns and toy theatres, as well as more obviously pedagogical material and magazines such as these. So the Boys Own series on classical fun, and there's an ornamental letter up on the top left-hand corner from that series, started from difficult school translations, as mediated through a fictional account in a periodical, so making that public school experience either more enjoyable or more accessible, or both. Recalling a fictional pupil from an earlier issue story who claimed that a noun was in the ablative case, to make it more difficult for us, Oddfellow took up the challenge to transform such intense dislike of classics, and particularly Latin grammar, into a fun shared experience of initiation into manliness. This was made all the more accessible by the fact that he acknowledged and even celebrated failures as comedy. His oddly defensive justification of his title, "Some of you may say that none of the above are in the classics, but if they are not in them they must be out of them," suggests that a few readers criticised his project, but together with the repeated exploitation of ancient material as fodder for acquiring modern, often scientific prizes, these classical puddles and riddles demonstrate one aspect of how classical antiquity became a prime example of balancing the entertaining and informative, and the moral and religious for Victorian child consumers. Thank you.